Why are beauty standards so diverse between cultures? Is it natural genetics or marketing? For example, thin European women versus larger, more curvy hips and behinds being the rage in America. Again, lots of places to go here.
Yeah, there's a lot of everything in the answer to this question. There are certain things that are I'm trying to come up with objective language, but there's certain things that are more beautiful than other things in objective terms. There are other things which are arbitrary and are hallmarks of membership and lots of stuff that is processed. You would expect men and women to process things that are proxies for stuff that matters, right? And
so like across cultures, particular waist to hip ratios in women, regardless of whether or not the preference is for a thinner women or larger women, still the waist to hip ratio preferences are more or less stable, which is suggestive of an interest, totally unconscious, presumably, in fertility.
Right. Breasts too, although I think there's a persistent paradox with this one, which is, to a point, larger breasts are something that you would expect men to be interested in because they are a proxy for the amount of resource necessary to produce a baby, which is not a small amount of resource, which doesn't mean that the resources in the breast go into the baby, but it means that a woman whose breasts are large or larger than some threshold has those resources on board.
That's only true when you're actually actively breastfeeding.
Nope. I would say not. I would say
there's no evidence that size of breasts outside of having a baby at the breast is predictive of how much milk you can produce.
I think it's not a question of how much milk you can produce. It's a question of how much excess resource. So for those who are not,
okay.
So human females are the only mammals in which breast tissue is enlarged when not lactating. So that's a fascinating and important fact. But anyway,
therefore clearly sexually selected.
Right. Therefore clearly sexually selected. It is an advertisement. It is an advertisement of the presence of resources. But what I don't quite get, and I don't get it either as, a red-blooded male or as a scientist, is why above some threshold there seems to be this obsession with bigger is better, right? That doesn't add up, right? To the extent that a woman has in some way physiologically demonstrated the resources to produce a baby, that would seem to be like a checkbox rather than, the bigger the better. So I don't understand why that seems to have been a priority that many men seem to.
Well, and this will end up being a cultural difference, and it is a bit peacocky, right?
Yeah.
That the big showy TNA versus a more slender aesthetic in some cultures is a cultural difference. Some of which is ascribable to differences in resources, not so easily done in the modern era between Europe and North America, right? But in terms of cultures in which there are regular boom-bust cycles of food availability, preferences for finding beauty in more heavy-set, both women and men, would have been effectively a potential way to prevent famine, not personal famine, like starvation, rather.
Well, I sort of think it's like a Tinbergen phony egg phenomenon. So Tinbergen, who was one of the early brilliant ethologists, I think he was actually Richard Dawkins' advisor. He did an experiment in which there was a preference in gulls, which was his study organism, for larger eggs. And what he showed was that there was actually no upper limit, right? That the bigger the egg didn't make any difference. Absurd, non-egg-like phony eggs were still preferred in some way.
Even when anatomically impossible, given the size of the bird.
Right. And so I guess it's a little bit like people's affinity for sugar and things. It's like there was no reason to set a limit on how much sugar to avoid, because the presence of arbitrarily large amounts of sugar in the environment just isn't a thing until industrialization. So I think it might be something like that. I have run into something recently, which we might want to track down if you haven't. Maybe you and I have talked about it, but there is this belief that beauty standards have changed radically in the West, that is inferred from Rubenesque paintings in which women with a great deal of what might once have been called pulchritude were painted, but the recent evidence suggests actually that this may have to do with the models who were available to the painters, not the preferences. And so that, in fact, this may have been misinterpreted. So anyway.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't heard that.
For a topic for another time.